Sam speaking. Hi, all good now. So my name, Sam. It's really starting slowly because we have some lag time. Okay. I want to recognise the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. So I think I'll change my how I recognise. I would like to recognise the history of the land here. The Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I would like to recognise their elders, past, present and emerging. The land has always been their land. And we're on Zoom, means that we're connecting from different lands of different peoples, and we'll recognise all of those lands and the history that belongs to them. So it's really exciting to be here today on IDAHOBIT Day. International Day against homophobia, transphobia, intersexism, and biphobia. It's a lot of English, but we're going to discuss it today in Auslan and the meaning of it all. So we have three really exciting panelists here today. We've got Kate. I'll get everybody to introduce themselves as well, and also to add your pronouns. So Kate.
Kate speaking. Thank you so much, Sam. My name's Catherine. My pronouns are she and her. I'm really excited to be here. I think this conversation is really important, not just in general, but particularly for the deaf community. When I grew up, there was so rarely any conversation about queerness, and even less in the deaf community. So the education and information was not accessible. So there was so little. So I'm really excited to break the ice and improve the conversation of the diversity that we have. It's really important that generally we're all more educated.
Sam speaking. Thanks. So Eddie.
Eddie speaking. My name is Eddie. My pronouns are he and him. Have I covered everything? I think that's it. Also, I think it's important that awareness is improved about the diversity that we have so that we can respect each other in a healthy way, because there's been not so much discussion. So I'm excited to expand that.
And lucky last, Jaya. My name's Jaya. This is my sign name, and I use she and her pronouns. Of facing lots of barriers and no access to information. So it's fantastic to have this discussion here today, talking openly about the deaf queer community. I think I've covered everything that you asked me to say. And Sam speaking. Yes, and next I'll ask questions to specific people, and I'm sure we'll cover everything. So I'm Sam, and my pronouns are he and him. I work at Expression Australia, and my role here today is I'm the lead on the Rainbow Project. If you need any information after this, please contact me. So I would like to start talking about the deaf community and the LGBTQIA+, the queer deaf community. Your experience and how you feel, is there enough awareness in the deaf community about the queer deaf community? Who would like to start? Who'd like to volunteer, the brave person, to answer the first question?
Oh, it's Kate speaking. Me first again? Oh, okay. Eddie, you've got your hand up. Eddie speaking. I'm happy to start. Really, the deaf community is already quite small and we're quite supportive of each other. Everyone sees each other around, but there's not always that respect. I've had pretty positive experiences, but I have seen negative ones too, but that other people have had. For myself, I've had a good experience, but out in other people's homes, I don't know so much. But really, my experience has been positive in the deaf community. I know in the hearing community, there are a lot of barriers and discrimination.
Sam speaking. Would you like to share a positive experience, Eddie?
Eddie speaking. Maybe I could talk about my coming out and how my family was supportive. They've just sort of let me be who I was. They didn't look at me so much as only a gay man. I came out in 2004, but they just kept accepting me. I kept it to myself for a long time. I wanted to come out at 18, but I was really reluctant. Until I was 23, my friends were saying, why are you not telling your family? Why don't you just come out? They'll love you. And, you know, I had my social group of friends, but I was the only gay one there. So I felt quite isolated in that experience. So I couldn't quite be myself until I came out and I felt free. I felt like I could finally do what I wanted, sign the way I wanted, not have to put on a straight face. I didn't have to try and match how everyone else behaved. I felt safe. I felt supported. I felt that if anything happened, if I was criticized, if I was discriminated against, my friends would support me. I always had their support since 2004. So at that time, there wasn't necessarily as much awareness in the general deaf community, but I've seen a lot of improvement from then till now. Back then, there wasn't as much information online, and now there's so much more. But yeah, that's my experience.
Sam speaking. Jaya, did you have something to add? Jaya speaking. I grew up in Tasmania and I moved to Melbourne. I really saw the difference between Tasmania and Melbourne because Tasmania is very, very close-minded. But in Melbourne, I think generally people are more open-minded and there are different events. And I felt with my identity, I could connect much better. Tasmania didn't suit me at all. But I have a great family and great friends who support me. So when I was growing up, I didn't identify as gay. I did identify as gay, sorry. But I was young. I didn't have access to understanding what it actually meant and how I felt. I felt alone growing up until probably 2 years ago that I came out as a transgender person. You know, I always felt like a woman, you know, but Tasmania was so close-minded. You know, I felt that I couldn't be open. You know, I can be who I am now. I'm a woman. That's me. Sam speaking. If you're comfortable, can you share more information about the Tasmanians and their closed-mindedness, do you think? Jay is speaking. Tasmania is very, very small, the community. Everyone knows everybody else. We can be very judgmental. There's no understanding really what queer means, you know, what identity means. As a gay person, yeah, that's accepted, I suppose. But until I came out as trans, that's very new. That's a very new here in Australia for the community. So I think that kind of shocked a few people and they didn't know what to think. Really, we need to provide some education to say what's the appropriate terminology to use, you know. a trans person or a man no, I'm just her. I'm just a woman. That's who I am. Just look at me. I'm a female. So I constantly found myself explaining this all the time. But when I moved to Melbourne, people just got it, they knew what the identity that I had meant. Sam speaking, I think you've raised a very good point. And we can talk more later about that. Now to you, Kate.
Kate speaking. Eddie and Jaya, that really does connect to some of my experiences. The experiences of queer deaf people and talking about your identities and why you might want to come out or not. I found that coming out really empowered me. Seeing all those stories of other people's coming out really empowers other people too. And, I think at the right age and the right time, the right generation, particularly with the internet, there's so much more information available for us. I don't think I would ever have come out to a straight person without that information. A straight person or a cis person they don't necessarily understand it, and they don't necessarily understand the benefit of having that information, of having those choices. So gender identity can be quite visual. People straight away make an assumption based on visual things, but my sexual identity, people assume I'm straight based on the way I look. And so that I can be often quite put down in that context. But like Jaya was saying, the Tasmania community is quite small. Even Victoria, we also have a very small community, and there are close-minded people. And when you add deafness on top of it, it can be so rare to have a deaf role model, but to find a deaf queer role model is even harder. So I was in rural Victoria, but when I came to Melbourne, I found that there was a lot more diversity, but of course, still the access to information was difficult. I found that I was more comfortable signing, but had more information in the hearing world. So intersectionality becomes a big issue. So talking now about my identity to deaf queers is harder than talking to a hearing person because there's more access there. So intersectionality is really the issue. Eddie speaking, adding on to that, I can relate. I grew up in a small community in New South Wales, about 3,000 people. And I remember feeling so alone as a deaf person. I didn't have a strong identity until I was about 21. That's when I started to find my deaf pride, or 22. And then when I had gayness on top of that, that intersectionality, it was a really hard time when there was no information, no access to information, no role models, no one to talk to. My group of friends, there was no one gay, no one I could really connect to. So isolating. Looking back, I can't believe that I managed to get through that. Yeah, I can definitely relate to what you said, Kate.
Sam speaking. Wow, similar experiences. So I was a Sydney boy, so like the intersectionalities between all those, the layers and layers to finding an identity, along with being deaf as well. It's a journey, isn't it? Finding your identity. It's really interesting hearing your journeys. So I'm just wondering, Jaya, you would explain about educating people. Did you feel it was a huge responsibility having to do that, and having to do that with the deaf community about your queer identity and different things? Do you feel that you had to continually do that? And did you feel the pressure of having to do that all the time? Jaya speaking, it can impact your mental health as well, that constant pressure and the constant questions and asking the wrong questions. I feel pressures, and I think it really impacted my mental health as well. I was trying to explain what was appropriate for people to say or to ask me, or the right answers to give as well. And there was no transgender information available either. There was no access to it. I was happy to explain to people, but sometimes I could become fed up repeating myself constantly. It was like a circle. You know, and the deaf people that I were with didn't know what transgender was. Like female and male. Like a trans woman, for example. I had to adapt all the time to match the questions that were being asked of me, and trying to teach people to use the appropriate wording. Kate?
Kate speaking, adding on to what you're saying, Jaya, that pressure of educating people, we definitely all can talk to that. We've all got that experience throughout our lives. We've spent so much time. And when is that ever going to end? When will people already have the knowledge? Deaf people have less education already than hearing people in this space. How can we catch up? How can we have that conversation that benefits both worlds? Myself identifying as bisexual, I've really struggled with people who think that bi means binary, that I'm attracted to men and women only. But bisexual actually means I'm attracted across the spectrum. So that already is something I feel like I constantly have to educate. And so that heterosexism of the community, assuming that men have to be with women, women have to be with men, and there's only a binary. I feel so comfortable relating to anyone, but then the deaf community are telling me I have to be one way. The heterosexist community are telling me I have to be one way. But when I'm queer and when I'm deaf, I'm always struggling with feeling like people are oppressing me as a deaf person and then what I have inside me as well. But really, it doesn't matter what your identity is, where you're from, what your background is. It's important that we're able to educate each other. Sometimes we don't want to have to teach people who are in a bigger position of power than we are. I think ourselves as the deaf community, we have to listen to each other and look after each other too. Eddie speaking, yeah, onto that. It makes me think, going back in school, gay people in general, or any LGBTQIA plus people, you know, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and that time there was no internet, nothing. So I was so frightened to be gay. I had no role models, and I was so frightened to be gay. I tried my best to be straight. I dreamed of being a straight man. I dreamed of having a wife and a picket fence, you know, we've all had that dream. I kept telling myself I could do it until I realized it just wasn't in me. I wanted to be who I was, and I was attracted to men. So then when I found myself in the gay community, I felt so much safer. But I did find that the gay community would discriminate against the bi community. And they had that experience of being discriminated in the straight community, and I couldn't understand why they wanted to put bi people down. So now, you know, almost 20 years later, I feel like that maybe still hasn't improved very much. It has. Myself, I'm not as involved in the party scene as I was, or the big gay community, so I can't talk as much to it. But yeah, it's a big deal. Education on that really needs to improve.
Jaya speaking. Yeah, talking about being oppressed and your identity, growing up constantly being frowned upon, A, for being deaf, and B, for being openly gay, and 3, as a trans woman. Oh, I had plenty of experience of being put down and oppressed. Yeah. I am who I am. It's me, and I'm happy that way. It's really important to be able to be who you are and not let other people make your decisions for you. Sam speaking. Well, this information you've provided shows there are huge barriers for us. As I grew up, I didn't really have a deaf identity. But when I came out as gay, I was just reading lots of information that went completely over my head. So I watched videos and chats, but I didn't understand it. So that was a barrier for me until I connected as having a queer gay identity. I found people with similar experiences. And I was wondering about your thoughts about how you can get through those barriers, get past them, and achieve what you need to achieve. Linking with information to the deaf queer community, maybe videos, or what are your thoughts about that?
Eddie speaking. I think it starts in school, in deaf schools or mainstream schools with deaf facilities. There needs to be programs there, or even in classes, or as a subject. Like when we're talking about sexual health, at that point, you need to start there and you need to make sure that's accessible to deaf students. So video resources would be good as well. I remember going way back at school, we were really excited about Alf, a TV show, you know, that cartoon. It's an old one, yeah, sorry. And someone would come on and come into class, and we thought that was great. We were so excited because it was live. So when you replace a person talking on TV with something live, you feel like you can make a better connection. And having something in common is really important. But that's for children at that point, because children will pick it up so quickly. When they've had that chat, it becomes like being gay is just the norm.
Sam speaking. Any other comments? Kate?
Kate speaking. Eddie, you're talking about formal education, that being very important. So we're talking then about curriculum in the Department of Education. But unfortunately, it's very straight, it's very cis, it's very heteronormative. I remember myself when I was young, you know, when we were talking about sex education, it was very biological. There was nothing about relationships. It was very focused just on biology. But I think it's important to get into the emotional side of things. How do relationships work? I think the curriculum needs to improve there. And to bring in someone to actually talk to, a representative of the community who people can feel they have a connection with. But then when we're talking about informal education, it's now mostly online. Yeah, there are spaces that you can go to. There's Mardi Gras, there's Pride. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the social space is where a lot of informal education happens. So like Facebook, Instagram, so many, TikTok, there's so many other platforms now. I think that most of that information is now in English. Yeah, you can swipe through, but you just feel like you're getting exhausted. I think we need deaf creative content. We need to encourage that. I know that deaf people are famous for making really long stories, but if possible, just little tidbits here and there, short and sweet. I know in New South Wales, there's Deaf Rainbow New South Wales, and they've got a few things, but it's been going for a while. Some information can be a little bit old, as it were, like it's a bit behind the times. And it's quite rare in the deaf community to have that type of information though. So I think when you do read that English information, you see some words there, Once you understand it, you can feel empowered to take on that identity, but there's no sign, there's no way to express your identity. At the moment, there's only English ways to express your identity. So I think once we can express that in Auslan, we'll feel more empowered, and that's where the gap is at the moment. Eddie speaking. Sorry, can I interrupt you, Kate? Talking about sex education in class, I remember in my class, in a mainstream school, everyone would always be laughing, and I was missing the joke completely. I had no one was talking about themselves. It was just giggling about a man and a woman together, and it all went over my head. So it wasn't until I had, my father telling me about a man and a woman and what happens that I actually understood it. And no one ever said a man and a man or a woman and a woman. It was such a different time. So I just respected what I was told, man and woman, but inside I felt like it was different. I was 12 or 13, but I just held on to it and didn't say anything until I came out at 23.
Sam speaking. Yeah, sex education needs to include everything. It needs to include all different aspects right across the spectrum. I think it's very difficult.
Eddie speaking. And if children know it, then they're prepared for it.
Sam speaking. Did you want to add something? Jay is speaking. Yes, I think it's really important to have somebody signing, talking about their experience and share that through Auslan. I think that's imperative. We really need to have that. My experience, there was nothing available. We need something. We need to share it. We need to get it out there, someone who can sign it and get it out there for the deaf community and get them to understand and follow through with everybody's journey.
Kate speaking. Adding on to your comments, Jaya, I think when I see another deaf person signing their experience, it has such an impact. It's so precious. At the same time, we do need to include allies in the conversation. Because if we as queers are always doing that education, that's an added stress. I think we need to share the load. The people who have the knowledge need to still do some work because they are not having the stress. They're not doing the work at the moment. They need to do that work. So I want to see more straight, cis, deaf people putting some information out there and doing some advocacy, because at the moment that is a barrier. When they're more involved and doing more work, that's when things will start to improve. I understand with all social change, there are phases. You start with the big protests and you start to get some change happening and people start to feel empowered about their identities. But the next phases are of respect and acknowledgement. But you always have to think about the people who start to become frightened that they're doing something wrong. A friend of mine who's non-binary taught me, and I really appreciate their effort. They were talking about me using the wrong pronoun for them. I had said he, I should use they. So if I use the wrong one, they told me, okay, I've said the wrong thing, just fix it up and move on. Just move on. Because people often will make such a fuss that it puts the load back on the non-binary person. So I think we need to acknowledge that you make a mistake and it's okay, and then try and learn from that. You can't change everything overnight. I wish you could, but you can't. So we have to think about that conversation and that collegiality to acknowledge where everyone is. Maybe a couple of straight people having a conversation need to be able to advocate to each other and teach each other. I've just learned this, I'll just teach you. Not like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you did that. You're homophobic. No. In a respectful way, teach each other, and that's how change will happen. When the load is only on the queer community, then it's going to be too much. But if we can all share it, then we can all be committed to change.
Sam speaking. I'm just wondering, so there's new English words, plenty of them, and there's new signs. I'm freezing. But new words pop up and new signs need to pop up. So in New South Wales, the deaf queer community are talking about things, about the signs they will use, which has been quite interesting. And I'm just wondering, do we have the opportunity to think of new signs and as a full community or as the deaf queer community, like a new sign, thinking of a new sign is quite difficult, and to get it disseminated into the community as well and make that change happen there as well. I think we need to take little steps. We've got the English word first, that always pops up first. Then who has a responsibility to develop the same time access and signs for us? I'm just wondering about your thoughts. I hope I've explained that correctly.
Eddie speaking. I remember looking at New South Wales's conversation about queer signs and hoping that something would happen here. But I was hoping there'd be a get together. There was a get together in November, maybe 2020, no, before COVID happened, with a couple of interpreters. And one interpreter signed trans like this, more like transsexual, and they didn't use the new sign for trans. And I said, oh, sorry, this is the sign now. And they accepted it straight away. They apologized and changed, which was great, and moved on. And from that time, I think that Better Together conference, it's really disseminated from then. So that's been really important. I'm not sure if Expression Australia is planning to do something. I know there's a project at the moment. So they did plan to do something, and then COVID happened and everything changed. And so maybe something will happen this year.
Sam speaking. At the same time, Expression Australia is planning to do something about it, but there's a lot of pressure on our organisation. I think we need to include the community. So yeah, that just have been thinking about that, I think.
Kate speaking. Yeah, Sam, you're saying that the organisation does have a project, that it's resourced, it's funded, but it's a good point that the community needs to do something, because we need general improvement. We're all responsible to each other, like Eddie was saying, to let interpreters know that signs have changed. Eddie speaking. It is a really hard one, because we're all already working hard to make our own journeys, but then to also have to educate other people. As Jaya said, it can impact your mental health. So it is nice to be able to give some of that responsibility over to an organisation. So there's positives and negatives to each side. It's hard because we're responsible, but we need support. So yeah, just it's interesting.
Sam speaking. Did you want to add anything, Jaya, about your experience with language or the barriers you faced with finding out things using English rather than Auslan? Jaya speaking. It's the same as Eddie said, really. The changing of signs too, and letting people know, oh, that sign's changed. It's no longer trans like this, it's trans like this. And most countries overseas have different signs, but Australia doesn't seem to have the same. Like pansexual, there's some sort of sign that's different, or bisexual. There are many, many signs. There are plenty of signs, international signs, but none specific to Australia. And I'd love to see the signs to be endemic to Australia, definitely. Can I ask you again?
Kate speaking. I was just wondering why you think that is, Jaya, that that vocab hasn't made it into Australian Sign, why there's less here compared to internationally. And have you been, why do you think there's more overseas than there is here?
Jaya speaking. Oh, I don't really know. I've just seen a lot of discussion, a lot of signs. I notice Australia steals signs from overseas as well, but we really need them in Auslan for Australian deaf people.
Eddie speaking. I think it's because we're a smaller community. I think particularly in Europe or America, there's bigger deaf communities there where they can use those signs and they're more connected. Whereas here in Australia, we're a big country and quite isolated in our cities. So I think that might be why.
Sam speaking. Language is really important. Identity, culture, history. When we borrow signs or take signs from other countries, it gives us the opportunity to express ourselves at the same time. But it's also a good opportunity as a community to have a discussion. What's our Auslan sign for that? And it's really hard to manage that, I think. That's really interesting. Hearing people have the English words, so where they don't face the same issues as we do, you know, we need to have something that connects us all using Auslan.
Kate speaking, sorry. Talking about language and the conversation about queer identities and improving that over the next while, I think maybe we don't have the language yet, but that's okay. What's important is to continue the conversation, not to hold on to the conversation until we have the signs, but through that conversation, that's where the language will evolve. When you have to explain yourself, that's when you start having to sign it, and that's where it will naturally develop.
Sam speaking, yeah, you're right. Through conversations, signs can happen. With a queer group, for example, and through the deaf community as well, and or the general community, just have a great big conversation. And so we all know and can learn and educate each other at the same time. A two-way conversation. Going forward, I think signs may just evolve from that. So I think we'll soon come to an end, but I have one last question to put out there about the general queer community. So the deaf queer community, is there barriers to the general queer community as a deaf queer person or not? What are your thoughts on that? If not, if you don't think there's a barrier, what do you think is a positive experience that you may have had in the general queer community? And the same if you've had a negative experience about a barrier into the general queer community, you can let me know. Yeah, just have a think about it and see if you can. I have an example. I have had a positive experience. When I was younger, as a queer person, I used to go out to queer events and I'd have an interpreter with me. Most of the people in there were queer hearing people, and they would provide an interpreter. And I felt seeing somebody sign there at a queer event was amazing and gave me good access. And at the same time, the general queer community had some, they weren't fully accepting, I suppose, of a deaf person in that community, because they still looked upon as someone with a disability, that I needed, you know, the language that the interpreter would offer it in Auslan. So I don't think they were completely open-minded at that time.
Eddie speaking. When I grew up in Newcastle, and when I moved to Sydney, I was so excited to see everything in the city and start to research myself. And I looked at the AIDS Council of New South Wales, and they had a youth group about coming, and had resources about coming out. And I wanted to go to their group, but I didn't know how I would access it because I wasn't fully fluent in Auslan yet. I thought, okay, I'm just going to go along anyway. And I was so nervous, and everyone was speaking, and I felt so different to everyone there. I was the one deaf person in a group of hearing people. And I had one person who was very supportive of me, and we started dating. But then one day we sat down and we were talking to each other, and they were saying, what's your life like? And we realized that we had a very different perspective. And I was quite taken aback by how different he was saying we were. In the gay community, people sort of are trying to get along, but he was just not wanting to try and really deal with my deafness. If I went somewhere on with a date, I felt like I had a bit of access because I had some socialization. But if I went myself to an event, people would say, oh, you're deaf, oh, I'm so sorry. And I just had enough of that in the end. So I felt like I was struggling through that, and I had to make my own way, really. So that was quite negative that I got from him, that oh, you've had such a different life experience. Yeah, I thought I'd put that out there.
Sam speaking, thanks for sharing that. I think it's time now to wrap it up.
Oh, sorry.
So in future, I think we need to have those open conversations here on Facebook, out in the community, in different groups. It doesn't have to be on Facebook all the time. We have conversations and we need them to continue. I look forward to be involved in the future. If you need any more information, please contact me. People of colour, queer people, we have so many different people, and we need to include them all in these conversations going forward. And it's IDAHOBIT Day today, which means we need to recognise the barriers people have been facing. And at the same time, we need to continue thinking about how we can solve this. Whose responsibility is it? Is it your responsibility as a deaf queer person? We need deaf allies and we need hearing allies. What are their responsibilities? How can we end discrimination? I'd really like to say thank you for watching us today. And thanks for my 3 fantastic panelists. I really appreciate you sharing your stories, your experiences, and your time with us. And I think this conversation has been really positive, and I'm looking forward to many more in the future. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.